We argue every day about politics, economics, freedom, but few realize every one of those arguments takes place within a pre-built framework of language. Who is the one that wrote that framework? Language, the veil that hides the truth. There is a silent paradox unfolding right before our eyes. The truth is not hidden in darkness, but laid bare in the light. And yet, with just a layer of cleverly applied words, it instantly becomes distorted. What was once called bluntly and nakedly is now dressed in a new garment, elegant, scientific, humane. And thus we, who believe we are approaching the truth, are merely gazing at a retouched picture, a whitewashed version, made easier to swallow. Look at the terminology of the 21st century. What people in the past unhesitatingly called torture, modern authorities turn into enhanced interrogation techniques, sounding more like a medical procedure than an act of bodily destruction. The deaths of innocent civilians in war are renamed collateral damage, a cold, emotionless notion, as if those lives were nothing more than crossed-out numbers in an Excel sheet. Printing trillions of dollars to bail out financial institutions is not called debt concealment, but quantitative easing, a phrase that sounds like a precise, clean, harmless mathematical formula. This is not just the cleverness of politicians. This is the nature of power. Modern power does not need overt violence, but is intelligent enough to make everything seem rationally inevitable. As Michel Foucault once warned, power today does not appear in shackles or guillotines, but in language, discourse, and consensus. It does not coerce, it entices. It does not silence us with whips, but with words that make us believe we are free. George Carlin, a clown in the eyes of many, saw this very early on. While society laughed at his biting satire, Carlin was leaving behind warnings. He did not only mock politicians, but also revealed the subtle mechanisms of what we call the American dream. They call it the American dream, Carlin said, because you have to be asleep to believe it. What seemed like a joke was in fact a philosophical strike. Modern society does not need to cover itself with violence. It lulls us with illusions. Recall how language has transformed the pain of war. During World War I, soldiers suffering psychological trauma were called shell shock, short, forceful, like the echo of mortar fire still ringing in the mind. By World War II, the term became battle fatigue, sounding wearisome, but no longer terrifying. Then in modern times, it turned into post-traumatic stress disorder. 4 words, 8 syllables, plus a hyphen, and the pain was locked in a cold, clinical box. The soldier was no longer someone screaming in the dark, but merely a case study. This is the mechanism of language. It does not hide reality, but estranges us from it. When someone dies, we say, he passed away, instead of, he died. When thousands of workers lose their jobs, the press writes, the company restructured. When one nation invades another, it calls itself liberating. The events do not change, only the words change. And it is precisely that change which distorts collective perception. Albert Bandura, the social psychologist, once conducted experiments showing that people are more likely to commit violence when that act is described in neutral terms. To hit someone sounds cruel, but to carry out necessary disciplinary measures sounds reasonable. Human nature does not change. Only the linguistic cover does, and thus conscience remains undisturbed. Carlin was not a philosopher in the academic sense, but he practiced philosophy in his own way, the philosophy of laughter, of irony, of exposure. He did not write treatises like Kant, nor build systems like Hegel, but he demonstrated what Nietzsche once said, language is the house of power. We do not think in things, we think in words. Whoever controls words controls the world. Thus the greatest danger is not conspiracies hidden in the dark, but truths wrapped in euphemism. An empire does not need to conceal its crimes, only rename them. A system does not need to prevent us from seeing injustice, only transform injustice into objective necessity. And so, as Plato described in the cave, we look at shadows and think they are real. We hear words and think they are truth. The question is, why do we so easily accept that linguistic veil? The answer lies in human psychology itself. The truth, when naked, is too painful. Words are like anesthetic. A globalized, complex, contradictory society needs soothing words to keep itself functioning. Imagine if every morning the news did not say, "The economy is adjusting," but bluntly declared, "Millions of people are about to starve." Could we still calmly go to work? But, as Carlin reminded us, it is precisely that lullaby which is the most powerful tool of power. When we are not only deceived, but also want to be deceived, then power has triumphed. People no longer resist the system. They become its defenders. Researcher John Jost demonstrated that when a policy is labeled permanent, people tend to defend it more strongly, even if it harms them. We not only accept chains, but polish them until they look like jewelry. And here lies the starting point of the entire problem. Language is no longer merely a tool of communication, but a tool of governance. Every word, every concept, is a door that either opens or closes our awareness. Once we become accustomed to collateral damage, we forget it means blood and bone. Once we become accustomed to structural reform, we forget it means the lives of thousands of families. Once we become accustomed to economic stimulus, we forget it means pouring money into the strong while the weak are abandoned. Carlin, with humor yet ferocity, reminded us that the truth is still there. We only need to dare to look through the veil of language. But seeing the truth is not easy, for it requires a kind of courage. The courage not to deceive oneself, the courage not to sleep in. Sweet dreams. Language and power, the mechanism of self-deception. If in the first part we saw language as the veil that hides the truth, the next step is to understand why that veil is so enduring. Power does not merely use words to polish, it rests on a deep human need, the need to avoid unpleasant truths. That is why we are not only deceived, but also long to be deceived. Language, in the hands of those in power, is both a mirror and a distorting lens. It can turn war into peace, oppression into liberation, dispossession into development. Recall the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Instead of admitting it was a conquest, the White House called it Operation Iraqi Freedom. Words transformed a war for resources and geopolitical dominance into a moral mission. From that moment, millions of Americans could sleep peacefully, believing their children were bringing freedom rather than dropping bombs. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic provided a vivid demonstration of the art of renaming. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into the pockets of large corporations were called economic stimulus, a phrase sounding like a vitamin shot for a weak body. But when a few meager $1,000s reached ordinary people, it was called handouts, subsidies, charity, and immediately stigmatized as creating dangerous dependence. The same mechanism of state-to-society money flow, but when the powerful benefit, it is sanctified, and when ordinary citizens receive it, it is demeaned. Here we see a double principle of the language of power. The truth does not need to change, only the linguistic frame does. Nietzsche once wrote, "Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. When a word is repeated long enough, it becomes reality." Stimulus sounds completely different from welfare, even though both are essentially redistribution of wealth. But power does not only manipulate words, it also exploits deep psychology. Researcher John Jost has shown, when a policy is considered permanent, people tend to defend it more strongly, even if it harms them. This is the mechanism of system justification. People prefer to believe the current order is reasonable because acknowledging injustice would mean confronting powerlessness. Better that chains be called social security or political stability than to face the fact that one is imprisoned. In the technological world, this becomes even clearer. When social media companies harvest every fragment of our data, they do not call it selling our private lives to advertisers. They use the concept of data monetization. It sounds professional, like an inevitable process of the digital economy. And so billions of people keep sharing, liking, commenting, without feeling exploited. The truth is right there. You are not the customer, you are the product. But who wants to hear that? Data monetization sounds far more reassuring. Looking broadly, this is not unique to America or the West. When the European Union imposed austerity measures on Greece, they did not call it forcing the people to suffer. They called it structural adjustment. Thus, wage cuts, hospital closures, and unemployment rates soaring to 25% were dressed up as necessary reforms. Similarly, when China blocks millions of websites, it is not censorship, but maintaining social stability. When a term is used often enough, it not only describes reality, but also shapes how we accept it. The intriguing part is, we are not only deceived by the system, we also want to deceive ourselves. The brain has a strange defense mechanism. When confronted with data contradicting our beliefs, rational processing shuts down while emotional defense regions light up. The result, we no longer analyze logically, we only protect the ego. As Dan Kahan's research at Yale shows, even solving a simple math problem, when the result conflicts with political belief, people are far more likely to get it wrong. We do not analyze to find truth. We analyze to reinforce belief. This is why, in social debates, we can argue for hours about free speech on social media, while ignoring the fact that those very platforms are harvesting our psychological data to sell to advertisers and politicians. We are busy with minor word battles, while real power operates quietly behind the scenes. Orwell, in 1984, foresaw this. Newspeak was not just a tool of communication, but a weapon to shape thought. Whoever controls language controls the ability to think. If a word does not exist, the idea hardly can. The greatest power is not to silence you, but to make you incapable of imagining anything beyond what it allows. But what is truth? If Nietzsche claimed that truth is but an illusion we have forgotten is an illusion, Camus reminded us that humans always need a little illusion to live. We accept flowery language because it makes life bearable. Who could endure reading raw headlines daily? Thousands dead, millions unemployed. The system serves only the rich. Humans need language to preserve a thin veil of illusion, for naked truth is too heavy to live with. Power understands this well. It knows threats and violence provoke resistance, but language soothes. Instead of forcing you, it lets you walk into the cage willingly. Instead of making you bow, it convinces you bowing is reasonable. As Foucault said, the most effective prison is not one with guards, but one where prisoners become their own guards. And the prison of language is everywhere, in media, politics, economics, even in the words we whisper to ourselves. The question is, can we escape this game? Or are we merely, as Carlin once said, those who prefer to live in the American dream to avoid confronting the nightmare of truth? One of the most dangerous illusions language of power creates is the illusion of choice. We are offered a choice between free market and government intervention, between security and freedom, between stability and chaos. But in reality, all those choices are pre-programmed, like a restaurant giving you 50 dishes, all made from the same ingredient. They call it diversity, but it is merely variation. George Carlin called this the illusion of choice. He saw that media, politics, and even markets build an Overton window, the permitted frame of discussion, and we circle within it, thinking we are free. We argue fiercely over whether to raise or lower taxes by a few percent, but rarely are we allowed to ask, why is the tax system skewed toward the rich in the first place? We debate healthcare models, but no mainstream politician dares suggest removing profit from healthcare. Orwell described this mechanism in 1984. The strongest control is not control of action, but of language and imagination. When there are no words to express an alternative, that possibility almost disappears from the mind. Thus, if capitalism is called economic freedom, if austerity is called budget rebalancing, then resistance is blocked at the level of conception. What is more frightening, as Camus emphasized, is that humans are not merely forced into illusion, but also love to live in it. We cling to populist language like a sedative, facing the truth that the system is built for the few, that justice is just a slogan, is too painful. So we choose to believe we have choice, that we are part of a transparent democratic process. Look at modern media, hundreds of news channels, thousands of commentary shows, countless videos, podcasts, blogs. One feels surrounded by an abundant marketplace of information, free to choose. Yet, in reality, most revolve around the same axis, legitimizing the existing system. Ideas that truly challenge the foundation, such as radically restructuring the economy or placing people before profit, rarely appear. So we passionately debate left versus right, freedom versus equality, without realizing both sides accept the same cognitive frame built by power. This is what philosophers call the invisible structure of power. It does not impose by whips, but by limiting imagination. We are not locked in stone prisons, but in language, in concepts, in definitions, we think are self-evident. But why do we let this happen? Why do people defend linguistic chains? Here, psychology gives an answer. Our brain hates contradiction. When truth conflicts with belief or identity, we feel discomfort, called cognitive dissonance. To escape it, we choose to believe the words that comfort us. If a war is called liberation, we are more likely to support it. If welfare cuts are called restructuring, we are more willing to sacrifice. Humans do not seek truth, but psychological safety. Foucault once wrote, "Power does not repress, it produces." It produces discourse, language, ways of thinking that make us self-regulate. We do not need anyone to force us to defend the system. We defend it ourselves because it has fused into our way of describing the world. This is the most sophisticated prison, the prison inside the mind. Let us return to a more familiar example, social media. Users may think they are debating freely, expressing their views, but in reality, all those debates happen on a stage designed to harvest data and sell ads. When we argue about whether a post should be banned or not, we fall into the trap, focusing on the visible content while forgetting the hidden structure. Power lies not in whether a post exists, but in the platform's ability to capture our reactions and turn them into commodities. Similarly, in politics, debates over cultural symbols, slogans, titles become massive traps. We are drawn into heated battles that never touch the true structure of interests. While society argued over masks during the pandemic, few noticed that trillions of dollars were quietly transferred from public coffers to elites. These language battles are like stage magic. The audience stares at the left hand waving, while the right hand performs the real trick. And as Carlin said, they don't need people to think. They only need people dumb enough to work and obedient enough not to question. At this point, perhaps we must face an uncomfortable truth. We are not only victims, but accomplices. We defend the language of power because it helps us breathe easier. We deceive ourselves because naked truth is unbearable. As Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, humans need illusions to keep pushing the boulder of life. Absolute truth might kill the spirit before it liberates the body. Thus, the question is no longer, how do we detect lies? But, do we have the courage to live with the truth once we discover it? This is the greatest challenge, and the point where philosophy meets life. Transcendence. The art of seeing through language. The truth, as George Carlin once emphasized, does not disappear. It is simply placed right before our eyes and renamed. The problem is not that we lack information, but that we do not know which language to use to call things by their true names. When a society unanimously calls war liberation, when an entire press calls dispossession reform, then seeking truth is like diving into an ocean filled with layers of linguistic smoke. Even when we see the light, we are not sure whether it is the sun or merely a reflection in the water. But transcendence is possible if we dare accept that the path of liberation does not begin outside, but within language. The most dangerous thing about power is not that it forces us to lie, but that it teaches us to use words that make us believe we are telling the truth. To escape, we must first learn to dismantle each layer of linguistic shell, each mask society imposes on truth. This task is not easy, for as Camus once stressed, humans need illusion to live. But if illusion becomes chains, then philosophy is the only thing that can break them. Carlin once said, "They don't want a population capable of critical thinking." That sentence can be seen as a concise summary of the entire mechanism of modern rule. They don't need you to be intelligent. They only need you smart enough to work, obedient enough not to break the rules of the game, and busy enough with useless arguments not to look up to see who is holding the strings. And to maintain that, language is the ultimate weapon. When you are surrounded by terms like stability, restructuring, economic stimulus, you no longer feel exploited. You feel you are part of an inevitable, scientific, humane process. Thus, liberation does not begin with revolutions in the streets, but with revolutions in thought. It begins when we dare to ask forbidden questions. Why must the economy revolve around profit instead of human happiness? Why is healthcare considered a commercial service and not a basic right? Why do we assume injustice is the inevitable price of progress? These questions need not be answered immediately. The mere act of asking is enough to shake the structure of power, for power only stands firm when people no longer dare to question. Foucault once reminded us that power is not something sitting above our heads, but something seeping into every act, every habit, every way we speak. Therefore, resistance is not only about rising to overthrow, but also about changing how we express and think. When we call a returning soldier a war survivor instead of a PTSD case, we restore his humanity. When we call aid for the poor the right to live instead of a budget burden, we are redefining language toward humaneness. Each change in language, however small, is the seed of liberation. Of course, we cannot live without a little self-deception. As Nietzsche emphasized, humans need illusion to exist. But the difference lies here. Do we allow illusion to become chains or not? A little illusion may help us laugh in the dark, but when the language of power turns illusion into a tool of rule, then awakening is necessary. Not a complete awakening, but the ability to recognize that whenever a word makes us feel too reassured or too enraged, we should pause and ask, who benefits from this feeling? Who designed this naming? And where are we being led? Philosophy, at its deepest level, is not about finding answers, but about learning to see through the fog of language. Plato described prisoners in a dark cave, seeing only shadows and mistaking them for reality. We are the same today, looking at restructuring and mistaking it for salvation, looking at stability and mistaking it for security. Escaping the cave does not mean destroying the darkness, but daring to turn around, daring to face the blinding light, daring to endure the pain when our eyes first meet the truth. It is a harsh journey, but also the only journey that matters. Carlin was dangerous, not because he cursed or was pessimistic. He was dangerous because he had transparency. In a world that favors ambiguity, transparency is a threat. Power can tolerate open resistance, but it trembles before those who dare look straight without blinking. And at this point, Carlin teaches us a lesson. You don't need to become an academic philosopher. You don't need to write thick books. You just need to keep the ability to call things by their truest names. When a government calls torture enhanced interrogation, insisting on calling it torture is already an act of resistance. That does not mean we must abandon all illusions to live in raw brutality. As Camus pointed out, humans need a bit of fiction not to fall into the abyss of absurdity. But the difference lies in this. Do we master our illusions or let them be imposed from outside? Do we choose words that nourish our humanity or accept words that turn us into tools? Freedom, ultimately, is not to live without illusion, but to have the right to choose which illusion we allow to exist in our lives. And this is precisely the task of every individual in the 21st century, to learn to stay awake before language. When a politician speaks of stability, ask, stability for whom? Instability for whom? When a tech company talks about community safety, ask, safety for users or safety for profit? When a leader promises freedom, ask, freedom within what limits? And who defines those limits? Each question is a cut into the curtain of language, and gradually, the light will reveal itself. Transcendence does not come from an instant revolution, but from millions of small moments, when we refuse to use the language of power and choose for ourselves the language of truth. When we share with others, not in slogans, but in questions. When instead of endless arguments on social media, we quietly expose the hidden mechanism of interests. When we learn to laugh at linguistic magic tricks, as Carlin once laughed, but with an awakened smile, not a lulled one. For in the end, power cannot exist without our complicity. And the strongest way we collude is through language, the way we repeat, share, and trust the words given to us. Breaking that cycle is the beginning of liberation. A society can change not only when it breaks chains, but when it relearns how to call truth by its name. Language can be a prison, but it can also be a key. The question is how we choose to use it. George Carlin saw all this decades ago. He laughed at language, laughed at false words, and through that laughter, he gave us a weapon, transparency. And perhaps, in a world full of illusions, nothing is more dangerous than that transparency. It needs no guns, no protests, only the courage to say plainly, what is torture must be called torture. What is exploitation must be called exploitation. What is deceit must be called deceit. That is not just a linguistic act, but a philosophical act. And from that small act, a door may open, a door leading to a society that can see through illusion, choose the language of truth, and thereby live as truly free human beings. Language can become the key that unlocks truth, or the prison that confines perception. And you, have you ever encountered a word that concealed the truth? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and let's discuss. Don't forget to follow the channel to continue journeying together in the next philosophical explorations.